Tyrion is one of the most beloved characters in modern television, and rightfully so. But there is a version of this character that the show told us existed, and then there's the version we actually watched on screen. And by the end of the series, those two versions had drifted pretty far apart. The argument I want to make is not that Tyrion was unintelligent. He wasn't. He was perceptive, well-read, emotionally literate in ways most characters in Westeros simply weren't. And he had genuine moments of brilliance, especially in the early seasons. But the show crowned him as the great strategic mind of the story, and when you go back and trace his actual decisions from beginning to end, the record doesn't quite hold up to that reputation. And I think that's worth talking about honestly. Hey guys, welcome back to Beyond the Screen. If you're new here, welcome. Genuinely glad you found this. And if you've been here for a while, you already know what we do. So let's get into it. In the early seasons, one of the things that defined Tyrion early on was his relationship with Joffrey. And here's where I want to be careful, because it's easy to frame everything Tyrion did to Joffrey as justified. And on a personal level, a lot of it was. Joffrey was cruel, unstable, and dangerous. But Tyrion repeatedly chose to publicly humiliate him, to mock and belittle him in front of others. And each time he did it, he deepened the animosity of a person who happened to be king and who had a very long memory. That really isn't the move of someone thinking several steps ahead. It's the move of someone letting the emotion of the moment override the calculation of the consequence. And those consequences followed Tyrion for the rest of the series. Later in Season 4, the situation with Shae is one of the most revealing moments in Tyrion's entire arc, because it shows the gap between how he saw himself and what he actually did. He knew she was in danger. He understood the threat clearly enough. But rather than being direct with her, rather than trusting her with the truth of the situation, he chose to push her away through cruelty. He made her feel worthless and discarded, apparently believing that was a cleaner solution than honesty. What he didn't account for was what that kind of rejection does to a person, and how someone hurt that deeply might respond when powerful people came looking for a witness against him. It was a deeply human mistake, but it was also a strategic failure, and for someone with Tyrion's supposed foresight, it's a hard one to explain away. Killing Tywin is another moment that gets complicated when you look at it clearly. The emotional weight of that scene is undeniable. Tywin had spent decades diminishing and weaponizing his own son, and what Tyrion found in that room broke something in him completely. But he had just escaped. Jaime had taken enormous personal risk to get him out. There was a plan in motion. And in that moment, Tyrion made a permanent, irreversible decision that could have unraveled everything and left him with nowhere to go. What if there were guards on standby? What if someone walked in on him? The emotional logic is understandable. The strategic logic is almost non-existent. In Season 6, when Tyrion found himself governing Meereen in Daenerys' absence, he tried something that reflected his genuine belief in the power of negotiation. He sat down with the slave masters and attempted to broker a compromise. The idea was to give them a structured transition period, remove the threat of immediate disruption, and buy time for stability. It was a reasonable theory. The problem was that the slave masters had no interest in honoring it. They saw concession as weakness, used the time Tyrion gave them to rebuild their strength, and then moved against the city anyway. He was even cautioned by Missandei and Grey Worm, who were former slaves, about the nature of the slave masters, and also warned not to trust them. But he ignored their warnings and went ahead with it. Tyrion had approached a conflict rooted in power and self-interest as though it were a policy disagreement that just needed the right framework. It wasn't. and the people across the table from him knew that better than he did. Season 7 is where the accumulation of strategic errors becomes hardest to ignore. The plan to take Casterly Rock was built on a real insight. It was the Lannister ancestral home, symbolically significant and tactically achievable. But the plan only accounted for winning the battle. It didn't account for the possibility that Cersei would simply let them have it, while her forces moved elsewhere to do far greater damage. Tyrion planned for what he expected Cersei to do, rather than the full range of what she was capable of doing. And Cersei, to her credit, was never predictable in the way Tyrion needed her to be. There's also the question of Euron Greyjoy, who Tyrion consistently underestimated. Euron was chaotic, aggressive, and undoubtedly the greatest captain of the largest naval fleet in the whole of Westeros. The alliance Tyrion had carefully constructed with Dorne, the Tyrells, and the Greyjoys was dismantled rapidly because it had a vulnerability Tyrion hadn't fully accounted for, and Euron exploited it without hesitation. Throughout this period, Tyrion also consistently advised Daenerys against using her dragons decisively. There's an argument for that restraint. The optics of burning cities mattered, and Tyrion was right to think about the long game. But the restraint came at a real cost. Every time Daenerys held back, her enemies recovered ground. There came a point where the Council of Caution stopped being wisdom and started being a strategic liability, and Tyrion was slow to recognize that line. Then there was the Dragon Pit meeting with Cersei. Tyrion went in privately, appealed to her as a brother, and came out believing she had agreed to send her forces north. Given everything he knew about his sister, her willingness to burn relationships, her ruthlessness, her survival instinct above all else, it is genuinely difficult to understand how he walked out of that conversation convinced she was telling the truth. She wasn't. Every single person could see it except him. When he told Sansa, she looked at him and said, "I used to think you were the smartest man alive." But still he overestimated reason over Cersei's spite, and that miscalculation had serious consequences for everything that followed. By the final season, Tyrion's faith in Cersei's capacity for change had become something closer to wishful thinking than political analysis. He kept returning to the idea that he could reach her, that some appeal to family or humanity would shift her, even to the extent of freeing Jaime so he could get her to surrender the city. But it never did, and the time spent on that belief was time not spent on more realistic strategies. Also, his decision to tell Varys about Jon Snow's heritage set off a chain of events he couldn't control. Varys was always going to act on that information. That was simply who Varys was. Tyrion knew that better than almost anyone, which makes the decision harder to account for. The fallout led directly to Varys' execution, a fracture in Daenerys' inner circle, and a deepening of the paranoia that would define her final arc. Tyrion didn't cause all of that, but he opened the door to it. And then his proposal at the council in the finale, suggesting Bran Stark as king, was the kind of decision that reflected something Tyrion had always struggled with: the gap between an idea that sounds elegant in theory and one that actually functions in practice. No prior knowledge on how to rule, no military experience, no leadership experience. Whether Bran was the right choice or not is a debate the fandom is still having. Here's where I want to land though, because I think it's important. Tyrion at his best, in the early seasons, in his trial, in the quiet conversations that revealed the depth of who he was a genuinely extraordinary character. He was perceptive where others were blind. He understood people in ways that were rare in Westeros. He carried decades of pain with a kind of grace that made him easy to root for. But intelligence and wisdom are different things, and what Game of Thrones ultimately showed us, whether intentionally or not, was a man whose cleverness was real, but whose blind spots were just as real, and whose reputation for genius had, by the later seasons, outgrown what the writing was actually showing us. He made decisions driven by emotion when strategy required cold clarity. The common thread through almost all of Tyrion's mistakes is that he consistently overestimated the power of reason and underestimated how much people are driven by emotion, pride, obsession, and ambition. In many ways, it makes him more human and more interesting than a character who simply gets everything right. But it does mean that the legend of Tyrion Lannister, the smartest man in any room, deserves a more honest look than most of us have been willing to give it. And I think he'd probably agree with that, if he were being honest over a glass of wine. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear which decision you think hurt him most. Like and subscribe if you're new. Peace.